Except you must leave before the land turns. Otherwise you'll be stuck there for good, you hear?
She does that a lot.
Oh, you'll have so much fun.
There is a very specific kind of childhood fantasy that never fully leaves you. It sits somewhere between memory and dream, waiting for one image, one title, one trailer to wake it back up. For a lot of readers, Enid Blyton's Faraway Tree stories live exactly in that place. They were not just books about children climbing a magical tree. They were books about possibility itself, about the idea that somewhere just above ordinary life, beyond the reach of adults, chores, school routines, and boring reality, there might be a rotating series of impossible lands waiting to be explored, Toyland, Spelland, lands where the rules of the real world stopped mattering and imagination took over. That is why the Magic Faraway Tree arrives carrying more emotional weight than a normal children's fantasy adaptation. It is not just bringing a story to the screen, it is stepping into a piece of childhood memory. And that is exactly why the result sounds so frustratingly mixed, because on one level, there is something undeniably lovely about seeing this world translated into a film at all. These books have existed in children's imaginations for generations. And the fact that it took this long to get a major screen adaptation already gives the project a built-in sense of long-awaited want. Add a screenplay from Simon Farnaby, whose family film instincts have done real work before, plus Ben Gregor behind the camera, and there is an obvious reason to feel hopeful. The ingredients are there. The cast is there. The source material has the right kind of elastic fantasy. So when the movie ends up sounding more pleasant than magical, more gentle than transporting, that disappointment hits harder than it otherwise would. The clearest issue seems to be energy. And for a story built on magical discovery, that is a real problem. A movie like The Magic Faraway Tree does not need to be dark or intense to work, but it absolutely needs propulsion. It needs that feeling that anything could happen the second the children climb a little higher. It needs surprise, momentum, and the sense that each new land might genuinely scramble the emotional logic of the story for a while. But from the way this film is being described, too much of it seems to settle into a soft, harmless rhythm. The children encounter eccentric figures, make a few messy decisions, eat sweets, stumble through a couple of mishaps, and drift from one curious image to another. That may be charming in fragments, but charm alone cannot carry fantasy. At some point, wonder has to become story. That may be why the movie seems to land in this strange middle space where it is not exactly bad, but it is never as alive as it needs to be. The world is odd, but not urgent. The characters are whimsical, but not electric. The events are fantastical, but not especially gripping. That is a dangerous combination in family filmmaking, because children will forgive a lot if the movie is alive. They will follow impossible rules, bizarre creatures, and nonsense logic if the movie sweeps them forward. But if the rhythm flattens out, all the imagination in the world starts to feel like wallpaper. The family at the center sounds like a perfect example of that unevenness. Foy and Andrew Garfield are both strong enough performers to anchor something emotionally real, but the setup around them sounds aggressively odd in a way that does not always deepen the movie. One parent loses her job because she created a smart refrigerator that her villainous bosses repurposed to spy on families. Which is the kind of idea that sounds like satire trying to escape into a children's fantasy. The other rents a ruined barn in the countryside to grow Italian pasta sauce. Which is exactly the kind of detail that can either feel delightfully absurd or simply random depending on how the film used. Based on this description, it sounds like the movie leans harder into quirky eccentricity than dramatic clarity, and that may be part of why the emotional stakes never fully ignite. Still, the parent casting matters. Foy and Andrew Garfield bring automatic credibility and warmth to material that might otherwise float away. Even if the story around them is bizarre, their presence suggests the film is at least trying to root the magic in a family dynamic rather than in a parade of disconnected fantasy images. That becomes even more important once the children discover the tree itself and begin entering its strange lands. If the adventure is going to mean anything, The movie has to connect those fantastical journeys back to something human. According to the official setup, the family learns to reconnect and appreciate one another through these adventures, and honestly, that is the right emotional target. A film like this should feel like play, but it should also feel like healing. The problem is that emotional healing in a children's movie still requires shape. It needs friction. It needs moments that feel like they could actually bruise someone a little before the story puts the pieces back together. And this adaptation sounds so determined to stay light that it may be sanding off too much of the texture. The emotions are described as simple, the characters mostly easy to read, the villain barely present, and the tone consistently airy. That can absolutely work for younger viewers, but it also risks draining the story of the tension fantasy depends on. Magic works best when it carries both joy and uncertainty. If nothing ever feels too threatening, too strange, or too emotionally sharp, then the tree becomes a tourist attraction instead of a gateway to something transforming. The supporting fantasy characters sound like they still have some appeal. Moonface Silky, Saucepan Man, and Dame Washallot were always the kind of names that made Blyton's world feel delightfully unfiltered. And seeing them rendered in live action is the sort of thing that will probably trigger instant affection in people who grew up with the books. That nostalgic pleasure counts for something. It may even count for a lot, depending on the audience. For children, these figures could still feel wonderfully strange. For adults, they probably provide the clearest line back to the books they remember. The issue is not whether these characters belong in the film. Of course they do. The issue is whether the movie finds something dramatically satisfying for them to do beyond simply existing as markers of the source material's whimsy, and that is really the bigger divide here. The Magic Faraway Tree sounds like a film that understands the iconography of wonder better than the mechanics of enchantment. It knows what these books looked like in the imagination. It knows the names, the visual weirdness, the soft fantasy appeal, the sense of childhood possibility. But knowing the images is not the same thing as knowing how to make them move. The best family fantasies do not just present magical things. They give those magical things velocity, conflict, and emotional consequence. That is why movies like Paddington 2 or other top-tier family adventures feel so satisfying. They are not just sweet. They are alive. They build. They escalate. They earn their emotional payoff. This adaptation, by comparison, sounds like it keeps hovering in the realm of that is nice when it really needed to reach that is unforgettable. That said, I do think there is a clear audience for this. Very young children may not care about any of the things I am describing. They are not going to watch it with a checklist comparing it to stronger family films. They are not going to step back and ask whether the screenplay needed more tension in the second act or whether the villain is too underused. They are going to see magical lands, colorful oddballs, sweets, wishes, flying machines, and the simple emotional reassurance that families can come back together. And that may be enough.